When the plague loosened its grip, the world did not return to the way it was. The streets grew quiet, the fields lay half-tilled, and whole villages seemed to sigh in emptiness. The Black Death had passed, but it left behind a silence stranger than the sickness itself. In this long, sleep-friendly story, we will wander through the hushed landscapes of 14th-century Europe, where abandoned homes stood like hollow shells, where survivors lived with grief etched into their bones, and where the rhythms of daily life were reshaped by absence. From the fields of England to the monasteries of France, from empty markets to the whispers of superstition, we will see not only what was lost, but how humanity slowly stitched itself back together. This is not a tale of horror, but of stillness. A meditation on the aftermath, when bells ceased tolling and the world tried to breathe again. Welcome, traveler, to the silent aftermath of the Black Death. The quiet streets. The bells had stopped tolling. For months, their clang had echoed endlessly across the town, announcing the passing of neighbor after neighbor, cousin after cousin, until the sound itself felt heavier than stone. But now, in the spring of 1350, the clappers rested. The silence should have been a relief, but instead it pressed down on the survivors like a thick, unseen fog. Elena, a woman of 30 who had once sold bread in the market square, stepped into the street with a basket that held nothing. The square was no longer a place of trade but a place of memory. She passed the stall where a butcher used to haggle with customers over the price of salted pork. It leaned now with no roof, its wooden frame half-rotted. A child's ball sat in the gutter, its owner gone. Even the pigeons seemed fewer. The air was still, except for the faint creak of a shutter swinging loose from a window. That sound startled Elena more than she would admit. She adjusted the shawl over her head and walked on, though her steps had no purpose. There was no bread to sell, no customers to greet, no husband to return to. He had been one of the last to die, feverish and raving, clutching at her hand until he could not. In the weeks since, Elena had learned that survival was its own burden. She did not weep much. Her eyes had dried out from too many tears. But her dreams still replayed the plague's terror, and she would wake in the night convinced she heard coughing in the next room. Others moved through the town like shades, appearing and vanishing without word. A man carried water from the well, his face hollow, his hair long and unkempt. A girl crouched near a doorway, staring blankly at the dust. When their eyes met Elena's, they quickly turned away. People no longer lingered in conversation, as if words themselves might carry death. The once bustling town had become a painting of absence. And Elena, basket in hand, could only wonder whether life would ever fill the empty spaces again. The market ghosts. Elena's feet carried her to the center of the square almost by instinct. Once, this place had been the heartbeat of the town, merchants shouting over one another, children weaving through the crowd with sticky fingers and stolen apples, monks rattling their begging bowls, the clang of coins dropping into them like small, bright promises. Now the stones were bare. Moss crept between the cracks where feet no longer trampled it down. The wooden stalls stood crooked and weather-worn, as if they too had aged decades in a single winter. She paused at the stall that used to be hers. She could still see herself there, rolling dough before dawn, humming to herself while the bread baked, her husband Tomas bringing her a cup of watered wine, his grin bright despite his tired eyes. She reached out and touched the stall's edge. The wood flaked beneath her fingers. A small bird, startled, took flight from the corner, beating its wings hard into the silence. "Bread?" a voice said suddenly. Elena turned. A boy of maybe 10 stood a few feet away. His clothes hung from his small frame, and his hair stuck up at odd angles. His eyes were wide, too wide, the kind of eyes that had seen too much. "I don't have any," she said softly. "I'm sorry." He nodded, as if he'd expected that. "I thought maybe you used to sell it here." I did, she replied. A long time ago. He didn't move. He stared at her for a moment longer, then looked past her, at the empty stall. My mum said she used to buy from you. Said your loaves stayed soft for days. Elena's throat tightened. What was your mother's name? He hesitated. Agnes. Elena remembered her. A kind woman with laugh lines and quick hands. She had died in the first wave. She was a good woman, Elena said, and the boy nodded again, looking at the ground. They stood there for a moment, two survivors bound by loss, and then the boy turned and walked away. Elena watched him go, her heart heavy. She felt the weight of all the names she could no longer say aloud, all the voices she would never hear again. The silence was no longer just absence. It was memory, stretched thin across the stones, clinging to the walls, woven into the air. And she was not sure it would ever fade. The bell that didn't ring. That evening, Elena climbed the hill to the small church at the edge of town. Its stone walls were damp with moss, and the heavy oak door sagged on rusted hinges. Once, the church had been filled with sound, prayers, hymns, the low chant of monks, the tolling of the bell that marked each hour. But when the plague came, the bell had tolled too often. Not for the rhythm of the day, but for the rhythm of death. A knell for every body carried to the churchyard, until the sound itself became unbearable. Elena stepped inside. The air smelled of wax and damp earth. A few candles still flickered near the altar, stubs of wax hunched like old men. The pews were empty, save for one figure sitting in the shadows near the front. It was Father Bernard. His back was bent, his cassock threadbare, his beard more gray than brown. He had once been a voice of strength, calling the town together in prayer, offering comfort at every bedside. Now, he seemed smaller, as if grief had carved him hollow. Elena, he said, his voice rasping. I didn't think you'd come. I wasn't sure I would, she admitted, her voice echoing faintly against the stone walls. But I couldn't stay away forever. He nodded, staring at the altar. I used to ring the bell for every soul. Every day, every hour. Until my hands bled from the rope. And then, he trailed off. And then there were too many? She whispered. His shoulders trembled. Yes. I stopped. I couldn't bear it. And now the bell has been silent for a year. The silence hung between them, thick as smoke. Elena walked slowly to the rope that hung by the door. She touched it, feeling the frayed fibers against her skin. Maybe it's time, she said softly. Father Bernard turned, his eyes hollow but glistening. Time for what? For the bell to ring again. Not for death this time. For life. For a long moment neither moved. Then, with a trembling hand, the old priest gestured for her to pull. Elena wrapped the rope around her palms and pulled with all her strength. The bell groaned, as if waking from a deep sleep. Then, with a thunderous note, it rang, loud, clear, startling the silence that had strangled the town for too long. The sound rolled over the rooftops, through the empty streets, across the fields. Doors cracked open, faces peeked out. Children stirred from their beds, their eyes wide. The bell was not tolling for the dead this time. It was tolling for the living. And in that moment, something stirred in Elena's chest that she had not felt in months. Something small, fragile, but real. Hope. The gathering. The bell's echo lingered in the valley like a breath held too long. At first, it seemed the town itself did not know how to respond. Doors opened only a crack, shutters shifted, and cautious eyes peered out into the dusk. Elena stood at the church door, rope still in her hand, her chest heaving. Father Bernard was behind her, clutching the pew as if afraid his legs would fail. Then, slowly, a figure emerged. An old woman wrapped in a patched shawl shuffled toward the steps, her face lined as though the years of plague had carved every wrinkle deeper. Behind her, a child darted out, barefoot, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. One by one they came. Farmers with dirt-streaked faces. Women with baskets that held no bread. Children clutching at their mothers' skirts. The bell had called, and they had answered, not because they were certain of what it meant, but because silence had become unbearable. Elena stepped down the stone steps, her voice catching in her throat. "It's only a bell," she said, as if to reassure them. Yet her own heart thudded against her ribs. "It's not only a bell," murmured the old woman. "It's a reminder." "Of what?" asked a boy with straw-colored hair. "That we're still here," she replied. The crowd gathered closer. They filled the churchyard slowly, as though unsure whether such closeness was safe anymore. For so long they had been taught to fear their neighbor's breath, their neighbor's cough. Now, to stand within reach of one another felt almost rebellious. Father Bernard emerged at last, stepping into the twilight. His eyes moved over the townsfolk, what was left of them. "You came," he whispered, more to himself than to them. A murmur rose. People were speaking again, voices overlapping, not about death, but about life. Whose cow had calved, whose roof still leaked, who had seed left for spring planting. Small words, but heavy with meaning. A little girl tugged at Elena's sleeve. "Will the bell ring again tomorrow?" Elena knelt so their eyes met. She wanted to promise, but promises felt fragile after so much loss. "If you'd like it to, then yes." The girl nodded solemnly, as though this were a pact. For the first time in months, the town square glowed not with fear, but with the low hum of togetherness. Faces softened, shoulders eased. The silence that had blanketed them began to unravel. The bell had not resurrected the dead. It had not filled the barns with grain, or healed the scars left by plague. But it had reminded them of something even more precious. That they were not alone. The market reborn. It was Father Bernard who suggested it first. The crowd still lingered in the churchyard, hesitant to part after such rare closeness, when he raised his hand and said softly, "Tomorrow, let us gather again. Not only for prayer. Let us meet in the square." The murmur that followed was uneven. Some nodded eagerly, others frowned. The market square had once been the heart of the town, alive with color, noise, and barter. But during the plague, it had fallen silent, the stalls abandoned, goods left to rot, cats prowling where merchants once shouted their wares. To suggest its return felt bold, almost dangerous. "What would we sell?" asked a farmer with hollow cheeks. "There's barely enough to feed our own." "Not to sell," said Father Bernard. "To stand together. To remind ourselves what the square was for. Trade, yes, but also trust. Friendship. The knowing of each other's faces." Elena could see the hesitation in their eyes. She felt it herself. The plague had taught them that closeness could kill, that laughter could mask contagion. And yet, what had silence taught them? That without one another, they were already dead in all but body. The next morning, the bell rang again. Its tone was lighter, as though it, too, sensed purpose. One by one, the villagers came. Some brought baskets, empty save for a crust of bread or a withered apple. Others carried tools, mended clothes, even bundles of herbs. They spread them out on the worn planks of stalls that creaked like old bones. Elena set down a small jug of goat's milk. It was not much, but when a child reached for it, her heart felt oddly full. Across the square, a man strung dried fish on a line, their scales dull but still carrying the smell of sea and salt. A widow displayed a row of candles she had poured during the long winter nights. At first, no one bought, no one bartered. They only looked, and smiled, hesitant, crooked smiles, but real. Then, slowly, trades began. A candle for a fish. A strip of cloth for a handful of grain. The air filled with voices. Not the clamorous calls of a market at its height, but softer, steadier tones, neighbors remembering how to speak to neighbors. Children ran between the stalls, giggling, chasing one another until their laughter rang out against the stone walls. And as the sun climbed higher, the market square seemed to breathe again. It was fragile, yes. The goods were few, the hunger real, the grief still raw. But the act of coming together, of exchanging not only items but presents, was worth more than gold. Elena stood at the edge of the square, watching the scene unfold. The silence had not vanished, but it had shifted, retreating like a shadow before light. For the first time since the plague began, she allowed herself to believe that life, though altered, could continue. Whispers of blame. The square had barely begun to live again when the old fear returned. It came not as a shout but as a murmur, passed from one bent head to another, slipping between words of barter like a draught through a shutter. "They say the plague did not end, it only sleeps," muttered a woman with a shawl pulled tight over her mouth. Her eyes darted toward the foreign merchant who had returned with bolts of faded cloth, his accent thick and strange. "And what if strangers bring it back?" Others nodded, though uneasily. The market thrived on exchange, yet suspicion clung like a stain. When a child coughed, 3 women drew back, clutching their baskets. A dog barked, and someone muttered that animals had spread the sickness. Elena felt the shift. The air grew tense, no longer light with cautious joy but heavy with the weight of accusation. It was as though grief, too large to carry, sought a target. A face, a name, anything to bear its blame. She saw it most clearly in the case of Tomas, the shepherd's son. He had always been a quiet boy, with a limp that made him slow in games. His family had survived the plague almost untouched, 5 souls where most homes counted only 1 or 2. That alone was enough to draw stares. One morning, a hen was found dead near the square, its feathers scattered like ashes. A small thing, easily explained. But by evening, voices whispered, "It was Tomas. His family is charmed. Protected." Witch marked. Father Bernard tried to quench it. He raised his hands at the well and said, "This is not God's way. The plague was no one's doing but his mysterious will. To accuse each other is to spit upon our survival." Yet fear listened poorly to reason. It had lived too long in their marrow. Elena found Tomas alone by the sheepfold that night, his face pale in the moonlight. "They look at me as if I carried death itself," he said quietly. "But I did nothing." "I know," Elena whispered, though her voice trembled. She wanted to take his hand, to promise safety, but promises felt thin in a world where breath itself had been dangerous. In the weeks after the Black Death, silence had been their shield. Now, as voices rose again, Elena wondered which was more dangerous, the silence that kept them apart, or the words that threatened to tear them apart anew. The market, though reborn, shivered on the edge of breaking. The square of accusations. It began with a sound Elena had almost forgotten, the hammering of the town bell. Once, during the plague, it had tolled endlessly for the dead. Now it rang again, sharp and insistent, summoning the villagers to the square. Elena hurried with the others, her heart pounding. The air was brittle, like glass ready to splinter. At the center of the gathering stood Tomas, shoulders hunched, a bruise darkening his cheek. 2 men gripped his arms, rough hands pinning him in place. The shepherd, his father, protested loudly, but his words were drowned by the rising swell of voices. "They do not sicken," cried one woman, her voice shrill with fear. "While my children lie in the earth, theirs thrive. Tell me that is not witchcraft." "I," shouted another. He curses the animals. That hen dead without wound, it was his doing. The crowd roared agreement, desperate, wild. It was not justice they sought, but release, from grief, from terror, from the gnawing need to make sense of what had happened. Father Bernard pushed through the mob, his robes catching on elbows, his face set in stern lines. "Have you forgotten?" he thundered. "The plague took rich and poor alike. Nobles in their halls, peasants in their huts, none were spared. Shall we now blame a boy, when death itself had no reason?" The crowd wavered, some shuffling their feet, shame prickling through their anger. Yet others clung stubbornly to the fury that gave shape to their pain. "Then why them?" a man barked, thrusting a finger at Tomas. "Why do they still walk when so many of us bury our kin?" Elena could bear it no longer. She stepped forward, voice breaking as she cried, "Because chance is cruel! Because life is cruel! If you blame Tomas, then you blame me as well, I who live, while my mother lies in the churchyard. Would you drag us all into the square until none remain?" The silence that followed was sharp, like the snapping of a bowstring. Tomas lifted his eyes to her then, wide with gratitude and fear. The mob stirred uneasily. No one moved. The only sound was the wind rattling the loose shutters of the baker's shop, a hollow, mournful sound. At last, Father Bernard seized the moment. "Enough. Let the boy go. Do not turn plague's ashes into new fire." Reluctantly, Hans released Tomas. The crowd dissolved in mutters, shame battling stubborn suspicion. No one looked each other directly in the eye as they drifted back to their homes. Elena stood in the square long after they had gone, staring at the empty space where voices had nearly torn the village apart. The silence that followed felt heavier than any before it. It was then she understood. The plague had ended, but its shadow still lingered, shaping them in ways they did not yet know. The turning of the fields. When spring came, the earth itself seemed hesitant, as though it, too, feared to awaken after the long silence. The fields lay empty, weeds creeping where once wheat had grown in golden ranks. Many of the hands that had bent to plow them were gone, and those who remained looked upon the wide furrows with unease. But hunger is a stubborn teacher. Slowly, the villagers returned to the land. Elena joined them, her skirts tucked high, fingers blistered from the wooden handle of the plow. The oxen groaned, straining in the traces, their ribs visible through their hide. She thought of her father, who once guided the same furrows before sickness claimed him, and she whispered his name like a prayer each time the plow blade cut into the soil. Yet something was different. Where once peasants had worked in silence, bent low under the eye of their lords, now there was talk. Quiet at first, then louder, bold with the memory of death's indiscriminate hand. "Why should we till the baron's fields for crumbs?" muttered old Merrick, sweat dripping from his brow. "When his halls stand empty and his steward has not been seen in weeks? Did the plague not take them as it took us?" Others murmured in agreement. The nobility had been decimated, their power weakened by the grave. For the first time, those who bent their backs to the earth felt a stirring of strength. If so many had died, then surely those who remained were worth more than before. Elena listened as she planted beans beside Tomas. His hands were steadier now, though his eyes still carried shadows from the day in the square. "They whisper of wages," he told her, voice hushed as though speaking of a forbidden prayer. "Coin, for our labor, not just scraps and orders. In other towns I've heard peasants walk away from their lords. They take the fields for themselves." Elena frowned, unsettled. The thought was dangerous, treason even. But as she looked across the field, dotted with far fewer workers than years before, she knew it was also true. The plague had stolen lives, but it had also shifted the scales. That night she sat by the fire with her grandmother, who wove flax with trembling fingers. The old woman's voice rasped, but her words were clear. "The world after the pestilence is not the one you knew, child. Mark me. The rich will find they are not so rich, and the poor will find they are not so poor. It is the way of things. When death takes half the village, the half that remains must learn new ways to live." Elena thought of the Baron's empty hall, of the abandoned cottages that stood like broken teeth on the lane, and of the whisper of wages. She wondered whether the silent aftermath was not only grief, but the beginning of something unspoken, change, carried quietly in the soil itself. The first shoots of wheat broke the ground a week later, pale green against the dark earth. For the first time since the bells had fallen silent, Elena felt a cautious stirring of hope. Markets of ghosts and coin. The marketplace reopened in summer, though it was scarcely recognizable. Where once merchants shouted their wares above the din of carts and gossip, now the stalls stood sparse, like teeth missing in a jaw. Whole families of traders had vanished. Cloth sellers' benches remained covered in dust. The fishmonger's table, where Elena remembered her mother haggling over salted herring, lay empty save for a stray cat sleeping in the shade. And yet life crept back in. Peddlers from other villages arrived, sensing opportunity. Their carts rattled into the square laden with grain, honey, and wine. But the prices made eyes widen. What had once been purchased for a handful of coppers now cost triple. A simple loaf of bread, once taken for granted, was suddenly a luxury. Elena and Tomas walked through the square together, clutching the small pouch of coin the village steward had reluctantly given them after the spring's work. Wages. Real wages. She could still hardly believe it, the feel of the cold metal in her hand. It was a strange comfort, heavy and solid in a world that had so recently felt as insubstantial as mist. "Look at this," Tomas whispered, holding up an apple. Its skin shone red in the sun, but its price was absurd. 2 deniers. For one piece of fruit. You could buy a knife for that last year. Elena smiled faintly, though her heart twisted. Perhaps it's because the orchards are empty. No hands to gather what the trees give. The truth was everywhere, scarcity. With fewer people, fields went untended, shops unmanned, workshops silent. But with scarcity came power for the living. Peasants who had once been ignored or beaten now found themselves courted. Lords who survived needed their tenants desperately, and so bargains were struck, whispered in doorways and across wooden tables. Wages for work. Freedom for loyalty. A tinker from another town spoke loudly in the square, his cart jangling with pots and kettles. "In Lincoln," he declared, "men walk away from their lords if they are not paid fair coin. They take work where they please, not where they are bound. Even priests cannot stop them." An uneasy murmur rippled through the gathered villagers. Elena felt it settle over her like a shiver. She glanced toward the church, where the priest stood watching from the doorway, his thin face unreadable. The church bells had rung again after Easter, but the sound was softer, as though hesitant, carrying less authority than before. That night, by the fire, Elena and Tomas spoke in low voices. He was restless, dreaming of markets in distant towns, of wages higher still, of freedom from the shadow of the Baron's crumbling hall. She, too, felt the tug of something new, though it frightened her as much as it enticed. "The world is shifting," Tomas said, staring into the flames. "Can you not feel it? It is as though the Black Death swept the board clean, and now we begin again. Only this time, perhaps the rules are not the same." Elena looked at the coins in her palm, the faint imprint of a king she had never seen pressed into the metal. For the first time in her life, she wondered if the silence left behind by the plague might not be a void, but a space, one waiting to be filled with voices not yet heard. A priest without a flock. Father Alric had survived, though no one could quite say how. Some whispered that he had locked himself in the rectory during the worst of the plague, refusing to visit the dying. Others said he had been seen walking the graveyard at night, murmuring prayers with a cloth over his mouth. Whatever the truth, he returned to the pulpit when the bells were strung anew, his voice thinner than it had once been, but still steady. On the first Sunday after the markets reopened, Elena attended Massachusetts. The pews, once crowded shoulder to shoulder, now sat half empty. The echoes of the hymn seemed to mock the emptiness. Each note rose and fell as if searching for voices that no longer existed. Father Alric's sermon was unusual. Instead of the fire and brimstone warnings she remembered from childhood, he spoke of mercy. "God's hand is heavy," he admitted, his eyes downcast. "But even in ruin, He gives us chance to repent, to begin again. Do not be led astray by false freedoms, by coins and contracts. The soil still binds us, as it always has, by His will." Elena glanced around the pews. Some nodded solemnly, desperate for stability. Others stared at their feet, unreadable. Tomas, beside her, shifted uncomfortably. She could feel his impatience vibrating like a bowstring drawn too tight. After Mass, Father Alric lingered outside, blessing baskets of grain, newborn lambs, and even the rough hands of those who asked. But the line was short. Where once the priest had been indispensable, to bless fields, to name babies, to bury the dead, now people seemed wary. They whispered of how many priests had fled, leaving their parishes to die without last rites. They wondered aloud whether God had hidden His face, and whether priests truly knew more than any other man. That evening, a debate broke out in the tavern. Tomas sat at a table with several men, their mugs half full, voices hushed but heated. The church said the plague was punishment. One man growled, his beard flecked with foam. But good men died, children died. And drunkards lived. Where is the justice in that? Another spat on the floor. Aye, and when we needed them most, many priests locked their doors. I saw monks selling charms like peddlers, claiming they kept the pestilence at bay. Tomas leaned forward. Perhaps it is not punishment. Perhaps it is a turning. A great reckoning. Perhaps God means for us to stand on our own feet. Elena, listening nearby, felt a ripple of unease. Such words were dangerous. But as she looked at the faces around the table, men who had buried their families with their own hands, she saw a quiet hunger in their eyes. Hunger not just for food, but for meaning. For new explanations, new ways of living, new voices to follow. And so it was that in the shadow of the plague, faith itself began to crack, not shattered outright, but weakened, questioned in whispers that grew louder with each season. The silence of death had made room for new doubts, and once they took root, they spread as inexorably as the plague itself once had. Wandering voices. Not long after Father Alric's uneasy sermons, a stranger appeared in the village square. He wore no priest's robes, only a rough cloak of burlap that hung like a sack upon his shoulders. His hair was long and tangled, his eyes bright with a fevered kind of light. Children were the first to notice him, for he carried a carved staff topped with a bird's skull, and as he walked, he sang. His song was not a hymn. It was a low chant, the kind that curled into the air like smoke, unsettling yet strangely comforting. By midday, a small crowd had gathered. The stranger raised his staff and began to speak. "The church is silent," he declared, his voice cutting through the market noise. "The nobles bicker over silver. But the plague, oh, the plague was not God's punishment. It was His message. A warning. The world has been remade, and only those who listen to the new order shall live in peace." Elena, passing with a basket of herbs, stopped at the edge of the crowd. She saw Tomas standing closer, his arms crossed but his eyes fixed on the man. The stranger spoke of visions, of angels who walked not in churches but in fields, of signs in the clouds and rivers. He promised healing through prayer circles and pilgrimages to holy springs, not through priests or indulgences. He told the people that every man and woman could speak to God without an intercessor. A murmur of agreement rose from the listeners. Some nodded, others crossed themselves nervously. Father Auric, standing in the doorway of the church, looked pale. He did not step forward to challenge the stranger. That night, the village tavern was alive with arguments. "He's a man," one farmer insisted, slamming his fist on the table. "Bird skulls and wild words. We've had enough death without courting more of it." But another shook his head. "Madman or not, he speaks what we've all thought. Where was the church when we dug our graves alone?" Tomas added quietly. "Perhaps the truth doesn't come only from pulpits." Elena felt torn. Part of her wanted to dismiss the stranger as dangerous, yet another part, a hidden, secret part, longed for something beyond Father Auric's weary eyes and worn sermons. Something that could explain the silence of God in a way that didn't feel like abandonment. The next morning, the stranger was gone, leaving only footprints in the mud. But rumors spread quickly. There were more like him, wandering preachers who claimed visions, who promised new hope or new fear. Some said whole villages followed them. Others said the church hunted them down. The Black Death had left empty pews and emptier hearts, and in that silence, new voices rushed to fill the void. Divided flocks. It did not take long for the village to fracture, not in open war, but in quiet, uneasy whispers. By the time autumn arrived, two groups had quietly formed. On one side stood those who still clung to Father Auric's church, who crossed themselves at every thunderclap and lit candles for the dead. They came faithfully to Mass, though the hymns echoed thinner than ever, their voices carrying more weariness than conviction. These were the elders, the landowners, the ones who feared change more than they feared silence. On the other side were the curious, the restless, the young. Tomas was among them, though he still sat in the pews each Sunday. He and others spoke in hushed tones at the tavern or in the barns, passing rumors of wandering prophets and strange healings. A shepherd claimed his cousin had touched the waters of a forest spring and felt his fever vanish. A weaver swore she saw a man in a cloak of feathers call down rain on parched earth. Elena found herself caught between. She still lit her small votive candles in the chapel, still whispered prayers to the Virgin, yet her ears tilted toward the voices of those who longed for something new. When her grandmother was young, the world had seemed solid, God above, priest in the pulpit, king on the throne. Now everything felt like it had shifted, as though the plague had shaken the very ground beneath their feet. One evening, Father Auric gathered the village in the square. His hands trembled as he raised them. "Children," he said, "you must beware. These so-called prophets wander with tongues of fire but no truth. They seek to draw you away, to sow confusion. There is only one path, one true church. Without it you are sheep without a shepherd." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some nodded firmly, others exchanged glances, and a few, even Tomas, looked away. Later that night, at the tavern, a different meeting took place. Tomas, his voice low, leaned close to Elena. "If the church had all the answers," he said, "why did we bury our kin alone? Why did prayers echo against heaven and come back empty?" Elena's lips pressed together. "And yet, Tomas, we're still here. Isn't that answer enough?" He studied her face, then shook his head. "No. Surviving isn't the same as understanding." The division deepened in subtle ways. Some refused to trade with those they deemed heretics. Others avoided neighbors who spoke too freely of visions. At weddings, at markets, even at harvest feasts, a faint tension hummed beneath the laughter. But nothing came to a head yet. Instead, the village lived in two worlds at once, one of bells and incense, the other of whispered rumors and restless hope. It was only when winter pressed its cold hand upon the land that the conflict sharpened, for the prophets did not vanish. They returned, with bolder words, and with followers who bore the look of zeal. The wandering sect. The first snowfall had just blanketed the valley when the strangers returned. They arrived not as beggars this time, but as a procession, men and women wrapped in cloaks stitched with strange symbols, carrying staffs crowned with feathers and bits of bone. They did not slip quietly into the village. They entered as though the roads themselves belonged to them. Their leader was a tall man with hair as white as snow and eyes so pale they seemed almost blind. He leaned on a staff carved with spirals, and when he spoke, his voice carried like a bell. "We are the witnesses of the dawn," he declared in the square, the villagers gathering in wary clusters around him. "We walk the lands the plague has scoured, and we carry with us a truth unchained from stone walls and golden chalices. We speak of a God who has no need of priests." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Father Auric, standing on the church steps, flushed with fury. "Blasphemy!" he hissed, but the villagers did not disperse. They stayed, listening. The white-haired man's name was Seraphine. He spoke with conviction, his words woven with grief and fire alike. He told of visions during the darkest nights of pestilence, when corpses lined the roads and bells tolled without pause. "The Church told us to confess, to kneel, to wait for salvation," Seraphine said. "But salvation did not come. What saved us was each other, the hands of neighbors, the mercy of strangers. The Black Death taught us, God is not locked in temples. He is among us, in us." Elena stood with Tomas near the edge of the square. She felt her heart tug as she listened. His words were dangerous, yes, but they were also compelling. She thought of nights tending to her father's fever alone, the priest too fearful to enter her home. She thought of her mother's burial, carried out with only neighbors, no choir, no incense. Hadn't it been true? Survival had come from each other. Father Auric, trembling, raised his hand. "Enough! These are lies, snares for your souls. Do not listen! Turn away before the devil ensnares you." But the villagers did not turn away. They lingered. Some even nodded. Seraphine saw it, and his pale eyes glimmered. "We do not come to destroy," he said softly. "We come to remind. The world has ended once already. Do you truly believe it can be rebuilt by clinging to the same stones that crumbled?" By the time the witnesses left the square, the village was buzzing like a hive disturbed. Some followed them to their camp beyond the woods, carrying bread and wine. Others spat on the ground, muttering of heresy. Elena lay awake that night, the cold creeping through the shutters. Her heart beat faster than it should. Was it fear? Or longing? She did not know. But she knew one thing: the silence that had followed the plague was breaking. And what rose in its place was not harmony, but a chorus of voices, each pulling in a different direction. The fracturing. The witnesses did not vanish into the forest like wandering vagabonds. They stayed. By the second week of their presence, the village was no longer whole. In the mornings, Seraphine and his followers gathered in the meadow beyond the river. They lit small fires and sang hymns no one had heard before, strange, lilting melodies that rose with the smoke and drifted across the fields. Villagers began slipping away from their chores to listen. At first it was the young, restless ones, but soon even mothers with children on their hips stood at the edges, eyes wide, lips mouthing words they did not yet know. Father Auric's church bells tolled louder each day, as though volume alone might drown the intruders out. From the pulpit, his sermons grew sharper, his voice ragged. "Wolves in sheep's clothing," he thundered. "They come not to heal you, but to devour your souls." Yet even as he raged, Elena noticed the pews emptying. Whole families left before the Mass ended, some not coming at all. One morning, Tomas admitted quietly over bread. I went to hear them. Elena set her cup down sharply, spilling water on the table. And? She asked, her voice thin. They spoke of forgiveness without penance. Of God walking among us, in our labor, in our suffering. They say the plague was not punishment, but chance. He hesitated, eyes dark. It felt freeing. Elena's chest tightened. Her father would have called it poison. Her mother, perhaps, would have listened. And she could not say. She remembered her lonely nights burying the dead. The church had not held her then. Only her own trembling hands. Conflict rippled into daily life. Neighbors who once shared fields now argued. Bread was refused at doorsteps, water withheld from pitchers. Old Anna, who had lost 3 children to the pestilence, spat in the square and shouted, If the church failed us, why cling to it? These strangers speak the truth. But the baker's wife hissed back, Better the church than heretics leading us to hell. One evening, the confrontation broke into the open. Father Auric confronted Seraphine at the edge of the meadow, the entire village drawn like moths to a flame. You tread on sacred soil, Auric roared, staff shaking in his hands. Leave this place before I call down the wrath of God upon you. Seraphine only inclined his head, calm as winter ice. If your God's wrath is real, Father, let him strike me down here and now. But if he does not, perhaps it is not we who are the liars. Gasps shuddered through the crowd. Elena felt her knees weaken. Father Auric's face blanched, but he did not move. His silence hung heavier than his fury. That night, half the village left the church bells unanswered, their feet carrying them instead toward the meadow fires. The fracture was no longer a crack. It was a cleft, wide and deep. The breaking of bells. It was on a Sunday that the rupture bared itself fully. Father Auric had rung the church bells earlier than usual, striking them not with solemn cadence but with fury, clang after clang, the sound harsh and uneven, rattling like an alarm rather than a call to worship. His voice could be heard spilling from the open doors of the church as he denounced the witnesses, shouting warnings to all who dared stray. But fewer than half the villagers came. Elena saw it as she passed through the square, the benches inside nearly empty, the faithful clustered at the front, while wide swaths of space lay bare. Outside, in the meadow, smoke already curled from the witnesses' fires. 2 flocks, grazing apart, no longer grazing at all but watching one another with suspicion. Tomas had stayed behind at home, his face set with quiet defiance. I will not listen to Auric's curses, he had told her. If faith cannot console, it has no place. Elena had come anyway, though not from devotion, only from a sense that something was breaking, and she needed to see where it would fall. Halfway through Auric's sermon, shouts rose from the meadow. A group of villagers, followers of Seraphine, marched toward the church carrying torches. Their voices were not angry but fervent, chanting words unfamiliar yet fierce. The congregation inside stirred, some clutching rosaries, others whispering. Then the door burst open. A tall farmer named Peter strode in, torch in hand, his face bright with sweat and firelight. No more lies, he bellowed. The plague proved your prayers are hollow, Auric. We will not kneel to a God who abandoned us. The church erupted in chaos. Some scrambled to leave, pressing against the walls, while others stood to defend their priest. Father Auric himself descended from the pulpit, staff raised, his face livid. Blasphemer! Put down that flame, or you will burn with it! But Peter only thrust the torch toward the altar. The cloth caught quickly, fire licking across embroidered saints as if hungering for them. Screams filled the air. Someone hurled a stone. It struck the stained glass window, shattering Christ's painted face into shards. Elena found herself pressed against the doorframe, unable to move, watching her village tear itself apart. Women wept, men fought with fists, and the sacred bell ropes were seized in the struggle. One boy pulled so hard in panic that the bells above crashed wildly, not in rhythm but in chaos, their clangs distorted, discordant, like the howling of iron. When the altar collapsed in flame, Father Auric dropped to his knees. Not in prayer, but in despair, hands trembling as if his faith itself had been torn from him. Seraphine, who had entered quietly behind his followers, placed a hand on the priest's shoulder. His voice, low but audible, said, "This is not wrath, Father. This is rebirth. The plague ended one age. Let this fire begin another." Elena turned and fled, the crackling roar of burning timber at her back, the smell of smoke sharp in her throat. She did not know if she ran from God, from Seraphine, or from the emptiness yawning inside her. Outside, the bells rang madly above, their sound fractured, their song broken. Ashes in the square. By morning, the church was little more than a husk. Its roof had caved inward during the night, leaving beams blackened and brittle like the ribs of some enormous carcass. The bell tower still stood, but its crown was scorched, its bells silent now, frozen in place as if stunned by the violence they had witnessed. Villagers gathered at the square, their faces drawn with fatigue and fury. Some clutched baskets of water, as if a gesture of penance for failing to save their holy place. Others stood with arms folded, eyes hard, unrepentant. Peter, the man who had set the torch, bore a bandage on his brow, but his jaw remained lifted. "The church burned because it was hollow," he declared. "We will not kneel to stone walls or gilded icons. The Black Death has shown us that God, if He is with us, is not trapped in such things." A cry rose from the other side of the square. It was Marta, the widow who had clung fiercely to the old rites. She pushed forward, grief carving lines into her face. "You've damned us," she wailed. "That altar was all we had left, our prayers, our memories, the souls of our dead. And you reduced them to ash." Shouts answered her. Some cursed Peter. Others shouted her down, insisting the fire had freed them. The square dissolved into argument, neighbors who had shared bread and wine now spitting accusations. Old friendships, once lifelines in the plague years, splintered under the weight of the night's fire. And there, at the edge of it all, Elena stood beside Tomas. He kept his arm tight around her shoulders, as though anchoring her against the storm. "Do you see it now?" he murmured. "There is no one faith anymore. No one truth. Only a broken village." She wanted to argue, but her words would not form. Instead, she watched as Seraphine appeared once more, unburned, untouched, walking into the square as calmly as if he had been waiting for this moment. His presence drew silence, even from those who had been screaming. He raised his hand, palm outward, the firelight of dawn catching on his skin. "It is not the church that is dead," he said. "It is certainty. What remains is choice. Each of you must decide, cling to the past, or step into what has come." Behind him, a handful of his witnesses gathered, their eyes shining with a kind of devotion that was neither humble nor fearful. Behind Marta, others crossed themselves desperately, whispering prayers into the smoky air. Two paths. Two visions. And no bridge between them. For Elena, the square felt suddenly colder than winter, though the sun had risen. She saw the faces of her neighbors, some she had grown up with, some who had carried water to her door when her parents were dying, some who had sung in the church choir beside her. And she realized, whatever path she chose, half the village would be lost to her. The bells, silent above the ruins, seemed to hold their breath. And Elena, for the first time since the plague, felt that her next step mattered more than survival itself. The splintering. The silence in the square was fragile, like a thin sheet of ice. Any word, any gesture, could shatter it into violence. Elena felt the air pressing against her chest, heavy with the weight of so many eyes searching for direction. Marta broke it first. She crossed herself, fell to her knees in the ash-stained mud, and began to sing, an old hymn, her voice quivering but loud. Others, shaken and desperate, joined her. The melody rose unsteadily, like smoke from wet wood. Across the square, Seraphine's followers answered not with song, but with a shout. "No more chains! No more fear!" Their cry echoed against the broken tower, drowning the hymn. They lifted their hands as if to catch sunlight, though it was dim and weak. Elena's heart clenched. Here were two halves of the same people, now pulled apart as though by invisible hands. A week ago, they had stood shoulder to shoulder, burying the dead. Now they could barely look at one another without trembling rage. Tomas leaned close. "It will come to blows," he whispered, and Elena knew he was right. Already, men were stepping forward, Peter, tall and defiant, facing Marta's brother, who held a wooden cross like a club. Their jaws were tight, their knuckles white. Before they could clash, Father Anselm's voice rang out. Broken though he was, coughing and thin, he forced his way between them. "Stop this!" he cried, lifting his frail arms. "The plague stole enough of us. Must we do its work now, too?" For a moment, even the shouting stilled. He looked from face to face, his own streaked with soot. "If you burn one another, there will be nothing left but ashes. Is that what you want? A village of ghosts?" But Marta's brother spat into the dirt. "Better a village of ghosts than a village of heretics." Seraphine only smiled at the insult, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Better a village reborn than one chained to rot." Elena's stomach twisted. She wanted to scream, to beg them to stop, to remind them of nights when they had shared bread and stories under the stars. But the words caught in her throat. She saw in their eyes that they were no longer neighbors. They were soldiers of different truths. By sundown, the splintering was complete. One group began rebuilding the ruins of the church, hammering charred wood into crude shapes, singing hymns as though the smoke itself would become incense. The other gathered in the fields, raising simple poles topped with scraps of cloth, Seraphine's words their liturgy. And Elena? She stood on the path between them, her feet rooted, her heart torn. Tomas urged her toward the fields, where freedom shimmered like promise. Yet Marta's trembling hymn still clung to her memory like a childhood lullaby. Night fell, and for the first time since the plague, the village had no single fire. Instead, two camps glowed apart from one another, one by the ruins, one in the meadow. The darkness between them was deep and heavy, and Elena knew it would only grow. The first blood. Elena hardly slept that night. She lay on the damp earth between the two flickering glows, one of hymn and hammer, the other of chant and laughter. Each gust of wind carried fragments of voices, scraps of conviction, and she felt herself pulled like a rag between them. At dawn, the air was sharp with dew. Birds sang cautiously, as if unsure which camp to greet. Elena rose stiffly, her back sore, and saw Tomas waiting. His face was hard, his eyes sunken with sleeplessness. "It can't last," he murmured. "They'll clash, and when they do—" He trailed off, his jaw tightening. "We must be ready to choose." But Elena could not answer him. Her chest ached with the memory of Marta's song, of Father Anselm's trembling plea. She wanted peace, but peace felt as fragile now as a spider's web, beautiful, but too easily torn. By midday, the sound of hammering from the church camp turned into angry shouts. A group of Seraphine's followers had crossed into the square, demanding timber to build their own shrine. Marta's brother stood in their way, cross in hand. "God's house will not be stolen," he barked. God's house is no longer standing, came the retort. We build for the living, not the dead. The words struck like stones. Within moments, hands clutched tools as weapons, hammers, axes, sickles still wet with morning dew. The air thickened with the sour sweat of fear. Elena pushed forward, shouting, "Stop! Please!" Her voice cracked, but it was swallowed by the roar of men. The first blow came from Peter. He swung his hammer sideways, not at Wood this time, but at Marta's brother. The sound of bone cracking echoed across the square. Blood splattered on the ruined stones, bright and shocking in the pale light. Gasps erupted. For a heartbeat, silence froze the world. Marta's wail pierced it, raw and piercing, her hymn shattering into grief. Then the square erupted into chaos. Screams, crashes, the dull thud of wood against flesh. Tools meant for rebuilding turned into instruments of ruin. Neighbors who once shared fields now struck one another like strangers on a battlefield. Elena staggered back, her hands pressed to her mouth. She saw Tomas rushing forward, grabbing Peter's arm, trying to pull him away before more blood spilled. But another man shoved Tomas down, and the clash continued, brutal and blind. Seraphine did not move to stop it. He stood at the edge of the square, his arms raised like a conductor watching his orchestra. His lips curved into something between triumph and sorrow, as though this violence were both expected and regretted. Father Anselm collapsed against the stones, clutching his chest, whispering prayers no one could hear over the din. His frail figure was a shadow in the storm. By the time dusk fell, the square was slick with mud and blood. The wounded moaned in the corners, the dead were dragged aside, and neither camp had won. Both had lost, though no one would say it aloud. Elena sat on the cold ground, her skirt stained crimson where she had tried to press her hands against Marta's brother's wound. He was gone, his lifeless eyes staring at the heavens. The plague had taken their bodies. Now the aftermath was claiming their souls. The village splits. The morning after the square ran red, a different kind of silence settled over the ruins. It was not the stunned hush of plague years, nor the soft quiet of morning. It was sharp, brittle, like the moment before glass shatters. People no longer moved freely between camps. The line was drawn, invisible but absolute. On one side gathered those who followed Father Anselm, who still clung to the stones of the old church as though touching them could keep faith alive. On the other, Seraphine's followers built crude walls of timber around their fires, their laughter now edged with defiance. Elena walked the square slowly, her head bowed. She saw women weeping over broken tools, men sharpening blades with nervous hands. Marta did not look up from the corner where she cradled her brother's bloodied cloak. Tomas, his face bruised, paced like a caged animal. It struck Elena then. This was no longer a single village. It was two ghosts of a village, staring at each other across a grave they had dug together. That evening, Anselm's voice carried over the square. Weak though he was, he stood once more at the broken altar, his hand trembling on the cross. "We must forgive," he cried, his words raw with desperation. "If we do not, if we tear at each other, then the pestilence will have won twice over." Some lowered their heads, but many turned away. Seraphine's people laughed, their fire crackling louder, as if mocking him. "Forgiveness is weakness," Peter shouted, a bandage wrapped around his arm, pride shining in his eyes despite the blood still staining him. "The old ways could not save us. Why should we kneel to them now?" A murmur of agreement rippled through his camp. Elena's heart twisted. She wanted to scream, to shake them all until they remembered what it was to be neighbors, to be human. But as she stood between the two camps, she felt more alone than ever. Both sides seemed blind, one to mercy, the other to restraint. The plague had emptied houses. Now anger emptied hearts. That night, Elena dreamed of the dead returning. Not as shambling corpses, but as shadows moving through the village, silent, watchful, their eyes full of sorrow. They did not speak, but their presence pressed against her chest like a weight. When she woke, she swore she could still hear them, whispering through the cracks of the ruined homes. It was no longer only silence that haunted her. It was the sound of something breaking, slowly, surely, beyond repair. Whispers in the ashes. The rift widened with each passing dawn. Seraphine's followers grew bolder, their fires blazing higher as if to defy the shadows of the past. They sang now, wild, coarse songs that rattled against the empty windows of ruined cottages. In the half-light they danced in circles, stamping their feet in defiance of the silence that had long held sway. Anselm's camp responded with stubborn piety. They rang what remained of the cracked church bell at dawn and dusk, its broken tones echoing thinly across the square. Each note was a plea, a warning, a reminder of order. Yet the sound only seemed to harden Seraphine's resolve. Elena moved between them like a phantom, neither belonging nor entirely rejected. Both sides distrusted her silences. Seraphine's men muttered that she carried the ghost of the plague in her bones. Anselm's faithful looked at her uneasily when she lingered too long among the ruins, whispering to shadows. What they did not know was that she heard things. The voices came first in dreams, but soon they slipped into waking hours. When she pressed her ear against the scorched beams of an abandoned house, she could hear soft murmurs, snatches of names, laughter cut short, a child's cry fading into nothing. She told no one, not even Marta. For how could she explain that the silence itself was speaking to her? One evening, while the factions glared at each other across the square, Elena wandered to the far end of the village where the wind carried less of their noise. She knelt in the ashes of a burned cottage and closed her eyes. The whispers rose at once, surrounding her, insistent, mournful. "They do not see," one voice sighed, thin as smoke. "They fight over bones," another muttered bitterly. "They forget us." Her breath caught in her throat. These were not words she invented. They were too sharp, too foreign to her own mind. She whispered back, trembling, "What do you want?" For a moment, only the wind answered. Then, softly, a chorus. "Remember." Elena staggered to her feet, her heart pounding. She looked back toward the square, where Seraphine's firelight clashed with the faint glow of the church candles. Both sides claimed to carry the truth. Both sides had forgotten the silence that held them all. That night she did not sleep. She watched the flames and thought of the voices, of the dead whose presence lingered not as ghosts but as memory demanding witness. If no one else would listen, she realized she must. For the first time since the pestilence, Elena felt not only grief, but a purpose beginning to stir within her. The voice of the forgotten. Dawn came gray and reluctant, as though the sky itself hesitated to look upon the village. The fires of Seraphine's men had burned low, leaving only smoke that drifted like phantoms through the broken alleys. From the churchyard, Anselm's bell tolled again, its fractured voice more hollow than ever. Two camps, two truths, yet neither saw beyond their own quarrel. Elena had not closed her eyes through the night. The whispers pressed close around her, a thousand threads of memory weaving into her skin. Each breath of wind carried faces, laughter, cries cut short. She had thought once that silence meant emptiness. Now she knew it was crowded, overflowing with voices no one dared to hear. By morning, her choice was made. She rose and walked into the square where the factions gathered. Her hair was uncombed, her cloak dusted with ash, her eyes hollow but burning with something deeper than exhaustion. The villagers fell into a hush as she stepped into the space between firelight and bell. Seraphine spat into the dirt. "The widow comes to wander. Will she at last choose whom she follows?" Anselm's hand twitched on the wooden cross he carried, his lips tight. She must stand with order, not chaos. Elena raised her voice, rough from sleepless hours, yet steady enough to still them. You quarrel over embers while the dead cry out. I have heard them. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Seraphine's men laughed nervously, but some shifted on their feet. Anselm frowned, his jaw clenched. Elena did not falter. She spread her arms, as though to gather the empty village into her chest. They do not ask for your fires, Seraphine. They do not crave your bells, Anselm. They ask only one thing, remember. The words hung in the air like smoke that refused to disperse. A child from Anselm's group, one of the orphans who clung to the faithful, whispered to the woman beside her. Remember who? Elena's gaze swept the ruins. All of them. Those who died alone. Those who died together. Those who were buried, and those left to the crows. They are here. In the beams, in the stones, in the very air. You fight as if they left nothing behind, but I tell you, they remain. For a heartbeat, the square held its breath. Then Seraphine laughed, sharp and cruel. Ghost stories. She has been too long in the ashes. His men chuckled, emboldened by his scorn. Yet even as they laughed, their eyes darted uneasily to the blackened walls, as if afraid the widow's words had summoned something unseen. Anselm stepped forward, his voice stern but uncertain. And what would you have us do, woman? Kneel before shadows? Pray to dust? Elena's answer came without hesitation. Not kneel. Not pray. Listen. The silence that followed was heavier than any bell, thicker than any smoke. For the first time since the plague, both sides felt the weight of it pressing upon them. And in that silence, though faint, a few swore they heard it too, whispers stirring, as if the ruins themselves were waiting to be remembered. The prophet of ashes. The hush lingered, long enough that even the hard men at Seraphine's back shifted uneasily, their hands tightening on spear shafts not to strike but to ground themselves. They could not mock the silence, not when it pressed against their throats like a hand unseen. Anselm broke it first, his voice trembling though he forced it into the shape of command. She speaks not as a widow, but as one led astray. Be wary, brethren. The devil too cloaks himself in voices. We must not be deceived by every rustling of the wind. Yet his warning rang hollow. The orphans at his side clutched one another, staring at Elena with wide eyes. Some with fear, others with a fragile hope, as though they longed for someone, anyone, to explain why the world had not simply ended. Seraphine spat again, but this time it was to mask his unease. Listen to her and you'll starve. Ashes do not fill bellies. Whispers do not mend walls. But he thumped his chest with a blackened hand. I can bring wood, grain, fire. I can bring strength. Elena turned her gaze upon him, and for once the warlord faltered. You would build a house with no remembrance, she said softly. A house with no foundation but hunger. When the wind blows, it will fall, and you will fall with it. The villagers stirred, shifting like stalks in a field when the storm approaches. For months they had lived only in the moment, the next meal, the next prayer, the next fearful breath. But Elena spoke of something larger, something that gave weight to their suffering. To be remembered was to be real. To forget was to die a second death. A child's thin voice broke through. If we remember them, will they leave us be? Elena knelt, her knees in the soot. She did not touch the girl, only bowed her head close enough that the words carried as if shared in confidence. No, she whispered, they will not leave. But they will not be alone. And neither will you. The girl began to cry, not with terror but with the release of something pent within her. Others followed, women, boys, even hardened men, some sobbing openly, some turning away to hide the weakness they had denied for too long. Anselm raised his cross high, his voice sharp with desperation. Blasphemy! She calls herself a prophet when she is nothing but grief wrapped in flesh. Do not be seduced by sorrow. The dead must rest. Then let them. Elena cut in, standing now, her eyes burning in the weak morning light. But to rest they must first be known. The words struck harder than any sermon. Even those who distrusted her could not deny the weight behind them. And so, though no side bowed, either Seraphine's men nor Anselm's faithful dared move against her. Elena had become something neither had prepared for, not a widow, not a madwoman, but a prophet of ashes, a voice for the silent. Whether saint or heretic, they would not yet decide. But the air itself seemed to bend toward her, as if the village had chosen its mouthpiece.